Alright everyone, fairly grim news from Africa actually. The Congolese Ebola outbreak just surpassed the third largest former outbreak in history, so now it's the third largest itself, and it's swiftly approaching the point at which it's going to supplant actually an outbreak in Uganda that happened some time ago, I believe a couple decades ago, which means that the only outbreak of Ebola that will have infected and killed more people, probably within the next week or two at its current rate of growth, since it's in the middle of a civil war zone, unfortunately, will be the Liberian outbreak that happened a few years ago, which killed off at least 10,000 people. I happen to believe that number is half of what actually died. Specifically because towards the end, a lot of people weren't even bothering to bring the bodies to the health workers or the sick to them, even if they were dying, because of fear of losing the remains. See, culturally speaking, they wanted to have graves, didn't believe in cremation, because then there's nothing to commemorate the ancestor. It's considered disrespectful within the culture. Burial being hands-on, the funerary rites regarding washing the body and stuff. You have maybe less of that in the Congo. The problem is you have a war going on. And so literally, these aid workers have been attacked multiple times. Some of them have been killed by Congolese rebel groups. So they literally have to be escorted around by soldiers. But let's say that you set up your tent in the fucking jungle. There's like some soldiers there, and then you've got 3 or 4 Ebola patients. If rebels come in and lay waste to the camp and scatter everything, there's the fucking Ebola smear everywhere. They probably kill, the Ebola patients anyway, because, why not? And in the process possibly get infected. You're up close and personal. The Ebola victims like, oh, fuck it, and they run at the soldiers and, basically just like cough up blood all over them. Could be a massacre, basically. It's basically like you become a biological weapon if you've got Ebola. Remember how the WHO and all of these other groups, when they had a few people with Ebola that were brought back to the United States for treatment, actually. And remember when they brought that one dude, I think he was a doctor, to Houston, actually, and the city was pretty much a ghost town for a few days because of panic about it? Now imagine that you have to quarantine that person in a field tent. When you're in a jungle where it's 95 degrees and full humidity, wearing a full non-ventilated hazmat suit or full hospital gown at the very least, the face mask, fucking gas mask and everything in order to keep yourself safe, and you've got the ever-present risk of being shot at, and there's poor infrastructure for actual transit, and some people probably won't even come to you. If you've got, flu-like symptoms, you probably have Ebola. It's like, well, maybe I don't want to take the risk of going there. What if it's not Ebola? What if they put me in the tent with other people with Ebola, and then I get it, and I'm like, oh shit, I just had a bad cold. It could be, a little bit of a problem. So over 300 people have been infected now. That's going to grow. They don't have any containment on this particular outbreak so far. About the only reason it's not burning through the population faster is presumably because large areas have been depopulated and people scattered around to refugee camps or whatever by the ongoing hostilities there. So instead it's being spread probably more by some of these rebel groups. I mean, at some point, some large group of soldiers is going to come wandering out of the fucking woods in the middle of the Congo, and they're going to be covered in fucking sores and dripping blood from every orifice. And it's going to be like a zombie army. The problem being at that point, if you've got a population that by and large they don't have medical degrees, they'd be like, well, shit, it's basically, it's like doomsday. You can imagine in some of these cases where Ebola, kills 60+% of the people that get it on a normal day. Sometimes, like with the Liberian outbreak, the death toll, I think, was actually a little bit higher per person infected. I think it was closer to 70% if I remember. Could be wrong. That could have been one of the other outbreaks, though. There have been 5 or 6 significant epidemics in history. You imagine your village gets hit by it and, half the people in it die. It must be a little bit like, because you have relatively little travel and contact from some of these small towns and villages in the middle of the fucking Congolese basin. It must be a little bit like the Black Death, in all honesty. You hear the word Ebola and people are ready to uproot at a moment's notice, the problem being that when people flee disease and war at the same time, you have literally the perfect conditions for it to spread around. The other problem being the number of people who are actually qualified and willing to volunteer to give aid and relief to these people and actually attempt to stop the disease the number of people will dwindle because they're literally being killed or held hostage for ransom and shit. So it's terrible. It's a worse situation, arguably, than the outbreak in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone several years ago. There it was a matter of it hit densely populated centers that nonetheless had very little medical access or anything like that. Very little, very little, no clean water supply, high population density, people that bury their dead in a hands-on ritualistic fashion. This is even worse because you've got a war going on. It's just like the Spanish flu evolved out of the trenches, essentially. You have large numbers of soldiers in filthy conditions, honestly. The flu gets in there. It spreads around and keeps spreading around because, the concept of literal quarantine at the time was basically impossible. And so it keeps reinfecting and evolving, and eventually the Spanish flu, I believe, pretty much evolves out of World War I, if I remember correctly. Like, literally springs forth from the trenches and starts cutting every 10th person or so down. That would be pretty bad. And Ebola is far worse. Somebody, they looked at the death toll, and I think that they figured that the Spanish flu was more deadly, like killed 90% of people. No, the Spanish flu just spread really well and infected a lot of people, so the death toll is very high. Many tens of millions of people died. In fact, I think over 100 million could have died. I think, wasn't the world population over 1 billion by then? By the early 20th century? I think it was. You're well into the industrial era. Generally speaking, people are living a little bit longer and having quite a few kids at the time, talking the Victorian era. They pretended not to know about sex while having a very large amount of it, and usually very kinky sex back in the Victorian era. Look at all those chastity belts and weird shit they had. Those things women wore to make their asses look bigger. It's like the most ridiculous period in fashion history, that's for sure. And some of it was really good, proto-goth, if you will. But Ebola is continuing to spread. There's no reason to believe it's going to stop until the hostility stops. That's probably not going to happen. How long has the fighting been going on there? I think it's been many, many years. I can't imagine that just because some soldiers die of, bleeding out of their eyeballs and their dick at the same time, I can't imagine that alone is going to cause people to lay down their arms. That's about all. Peace out.